The autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 days when Margaret first noticed the broken-down sedan on Maple Street. She had driven past it twice that Tuesday morning on her way to the grocery store and again when returning home with bags of ingredients for the apple pie she planned to bake for her book club. The car sat there like a wounded bird with its hood propped open and hazard lights blinking weakly against the grey afternoon sky. Margaret pulled into her driveway and found herself glancing back at the stranded vehicle through her kitchen window as she unpacked her groceries. There was something about abandoned things that tugged at her heart these days. Perhaps it was the way her own life had felt abandoned since Robert passed 2 years ago, leaving her in this quiet house with its too many empty rooms and too few voices. She was arranging apples in her fruit bowl when she saw him, a tall man in work clothes, walking toward the broken car with a toolbox in one hand and an umbrella in the other. He moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to fixing things that others had given up on. Margaret found herself lingering by the window longer than necessary, watching as he bent over the engine. There was something decent about the way he worked methodically and patiently despite the persistent drizzle. She noticed a small figure sitting in the passenger seat of the car, a little girl with dark braids pressed against the window watching the man work. The child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, and Margaret felt that familiar maternal tug she thought had faded with her own children's departure from home. Without quite deciding to do so, Margaret found herself putting on her raincoat and walking across the street. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. The man looked up as she neared, and she was struck by his kind eyes and the gentle way he smiled despite clearly being frustrated with whatever mechanical problem he was facing. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, "I live just across the street and I noticed you've been working on this for a while now." The man straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "Yes ma'am," he replied, "I'm Tom Bradley, and this old girl here just decided she'd had enough for today." He gestured toward the engine with the fond exasperation of someone talking about a beloved but stubborn pet. "I think it might be the alternator, but I won't know for sure until I can get her to my shop." Margaret glanced toward the little girl in the car who was watching their conversation with large curious eyes. "That's quite a helper you have there," she observed with a warm smile. Tom's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "That's Emma," he said, and his voice carried that particular note of love and pride that comes when a parent speaks of their child. "She's been my co-pilot ever since her mom passed 3 years ago." The simple statement hit Margaret like a gentle wave. Here was another soul navigating the choppy waters of loss and single parenthood at that. "I'm Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "Margaret Sullivan, and I was wondering if you and Emma might like to come inside while you wait for whatever help you've called." Tom hesitated, clearly not wanting to impose. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Sullivan, but we'll be fine." "Please," Margaret insisted, "it's getting colder and that little one shouldn't be sitting in a cold car." She saw Tom glance at Emma, who was indeed looking chilled despite her winter coat. "And I just happen to have hot chocolate and fresh cookies." Emma's eyes lit up at the mention of hot chocolate, and Tom found himself nodding. "That would be very kind," he said, "if you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Margaret replied, already feeling lighter than she had in weeks. As they crossed the street together, Emma slipped her small hand into Margaret's, and the gesture was so natural and trusting that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Inside the warm kitchen, Emma settled at the round oak table that had hosted countless family meals over the years while Tom called his brother, who ran a tow truck service. Margaret busied herself heating milk for hot chocolate and arranging her homemade oatmeal cookies on a plate. She found herself humming softly as she worked, something she hadn't done in months. "Your house smells like my grandma's used to," Emma said in her clear child's voice. "Like cinnamon and something safe." Margaret paused in her stirring, touched by the observation. "That's one of the nicest compliments I've ever received, sweetheart." As they sat around the table sharing cookies and hot chocolate, Margaret learned that Tom was a mechanic who specialized in restoring classic cars. He had taken over his father's shop 5 years ago and was raising Emma on his own with help from his mother, who lived nearby. Emma was in 2nd grade and loved to read and help her father in the garage on weekends. "She's got a good eye for what's wrong with an engine," Tom said with obvious pride. "Sometimes she spots things I miss." Emma beamed at the praise and Margaret felt her heart expanding in a way it hadn't since her own children were small. There was something about this little family that felt like coming home. When Tom's brother arrived with the tow truck, Margaret found herself reluctant to see them go. "Thank you so much for your kindness," Tom said as they prepared to leave. "You didn't have to help strangers, but you did, and that means more than you know." Margaret waved off his thanks. "Please," she said, "it was my pleasure." She meant it more than she could express. As she watched the tow truck disappear around the corner with Tom's sedan, Margaret felt the house settle back into its familiar quiet. But somehow the silence felt different now, less empty and more expectant, as if the house itself was hoping for their return. 3 days later, Margaret was surprised to hear a knock at her door. She opened it to find Tom standing on her porch holding a potted mum in autumn colors and Emma beside him clutching a handmade card. "We wanted to thank you properly," Tom said with that gentle smile she remembered. "And Emma insisted on making you something." Emma thrust the card forward shyly. It was decorated with crayon drawings of flowers and hearts, and inside, in careful second-grade handwriting, it read, "Thank you for being nice to me and Daddy, love, Emma." Margaret felt her eyes well up as she invited them in for coffee and milk. This time their visit lasted longer. Emma curled up in the corner of Margaret's sofa with a book from the small library Margaret kept for when her grandchildren visited, while Tom and Margaret talked at the kitchen table. They discovered they had both lost spouses to cancer. Both knew the particular loneliness of eating dinner alone and making decisions without a partner to consult. They talked about the challenges of grief and the unexpected moments when joy still managed to break through. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized she felt more like herself than she had in 2 years. When it was time for them to leave, Emma hugged Margaret tightly. "Can we come back soon?" she whispered. "You make everything feel warmer." Over the following weeks their visits became a regular occurrence. Tom would stop by after work, sometimes bringing Emma and sometimes coming alone when she was with her grandmother. He helped Margaret with small repairs around the house. The leaky faucet that had been dripping for months, the loose step on the back porch that she kept meaning to fix, the storm window that stuck every time she tried to open it. Margaret in turn became a regular at Tom's garage. She would stop by with thermoses of coffee on cold mornings or sandwiches when she knew he was working late. Emma began spending Saturday afternoons at Margaret's house, helping her bake cookies or work in the small garden behind the house. One evening in November, as they sat by Margaret's fireplace watching Emma play with a puzzle Margaret had brought down from the attic, Tom cleared his throat. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the scarf she was knitting for Emma. "Emma's been asking me some questions," he continued, "and I'm not sure how to answer them." "What kind of questions?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. Tom smiled ruefully. "She wants to know if you might want to be her mom." Margaret set down her knitting needles, her heart suddenly racing. "She said she prays every night that you and I will get married so she can have a mom and I can have someone to take care of me." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Tom," she began, but he held up his hand. "I know it might seem too soon or too complicated," he said. "We've both been through loss and we both know how precious and fragile love can be." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "But I also know that Emma isn't the only one who's been hoping." Margaret looked at this good man who had wandered into her life with his broken car and his beautiful daughter. She thought about the way her house felt alive again when they were there, the way Emma's laughter filled spaces that had been silent for too long, the way Tom's presence made even ordinary moments feel meaningful. "I've been hoping too," she admitted softly. That night, after Tom and Emma had gone home, Margaret stood at her kitchen window looking out at the street where she had first seen them. She thought about the unexpected ways life could change, how kindness offered freely could create connections that transformed everything, how love could arrive quietly wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox. The wedding took place the following spring in Margaret's backyard under the apple tree that had bloomed more abundantly than it had in years. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, insisting that she needed to do both jobs to make sure everything was perfect. Tom's mother and Margaret's children and grandchildren gathered to witness the joining of two families that had found each other through simple human kindness. As Margaret watched Emma scatter rose petals with serious concentration, she remembered the little girl in the car that first rainy day. How she had sat so quietly waiting for someone to fix what was broken. Now Emma ran freely between the garage and the garden, between her father's world of engines and tools and Margaret's world of books and baking. She had two grandmothers who competed to spoil her and a house that always smelled like something good was cooking. That evening, as they cleaned up from the celebration, Emma helped Margaret gather the scattered rose petals. "I'm glad Daddy's car broke down that day," Emma said matter-of-factly, "because that's how we found you." Margaret smiled and gathered her new daughter into her arms. "Sometimes," she said, "the best things happen when we're not looking for them. Sometimes the very best things come from just being kind to someone who needs help." As they stood together in the garden with the last light of day painting everything golden, Margaret understood that some repairs go far beyond alternators and engines. Some fixing happens in the heart. Some healing comes from the simple act of opening your door to strangers who turn out to be the family you never knew you were waiting for.